My mother called me the Tuesday before our family's long-planned beach vacation and told me, in a voice colder than I had ever heard her use with me, that my children didn't deserve to go, not after what they'd said to their cousins. My name is Wynne Ashdown, 37 years old, living outside Burlington, Vermont, and I want to explain, before anything else, that my 10-year-old twins, Sawyer and Piper, are close with their cousins in a way that has always been one of the genuine joys of our extended family. Video calls twice a week, an entire shared universe of inside jokes, the kind of cousin closeness I'd always hoped my own children would have. What exactly are you accusing them of? I asked my mother, Eleanora, trying to keep my voice steady even as my stomach dropped with a confusion I couldn't immediately place. Celestine told me everything, my mother said, referring to my older sister, whose 2 children, Wren and August, were close in age to my own twins. Piper apparently told August that he was too poor to matter, and Sawyer called Wren's artwork embarrassing in front of the entire cousin group chat. I raised you better than to let your children treat family that way, Wynne. I'm not funding a vacation for children who speak to their own cousins like that. I sat in stunned silence for a long moment, because the accusation didn't match anything I recognized about my own children, who I had, admittedly, occasionally overheard being ordinary, imperfect 10-year-olds with each other, but never cruel, and certainly never in the specific, pointed way my mother was describing. I want to be honest about how disorienting it felt to have my mother deliver this verdict with such complete certainty, offering no opportunity for me to actually investigate the claim before the punishment. Exclusion from a vacation my mother had been planning and partially funding for 8 months had already been decided. I called Piper and Sawyer into the kitchen that evening, and I want to tell you honestly that I approached the conversation the way I try to approach every difficult conversation with my kids. Directly, without assuming guilt, but genuinely open to the possibility that they had, in fact, said something unkind that needed to be addressed. Both of them looked at me with the specific, wide-eyed confusion of children who have absolutely no idea what they're being accused of, and after several minutes of careful, patient questioning, I became increasingly convinced that whatever had happened, it wasn't what my mother had described. "We didn't say any of that," Piper said, her voice cracking with the particular distress of being blamed for something you didn't do. "August and Wren were the ones being mean in the chat. They said our house was basically a trailer compared to theirs, and when we tried to explain that wasn't a nice thing to say, they got mad and left the chat. I want to be honest that my first instinct, hearing this, was simple parental defensiveness. But I've learned, over years of parenting, that both sides of a children's conflict usually contain at least some kernel of truth, and I understood that I needed actual evidence before I could responsibly determine what had actually happened, rather than simply trusting my own children's account over my sister's. I asked Piper if the group chat conversation was still accessible, and within a few minutes, sitting together at our kitchen table, we scrolled back through nearly 3 weeks of messages on the shared kids messaging app the 4 cousins used, an app that, fortunately, preserved the full conversation history rather than allowing messages to be deleted once sent. What I found, reading through that conversation slowly and carefully, was considerably more complicated than either my mother's accusation or my children's initial explanation. Wren and August had, in fact, made several comments over the preceding weeks that could reasonably be described as unkind. Comments about our smaller house, about my not having a fancy job like their father's, about a hand-me-down bicycle Sawyer had mentioned receiving from a family friend. Piper and Sawyer's responses, while not perfectly gracious, had been considerably more measured than my mother's accusation suggested. Piper's actual comment, which I found exactly as written, had been, "That's not a nice thing to say. Our house isn't a trailer. It's just smaller than yours." A defensive but hardly cruel response to what had actually been a fairly pointed insult from her cousin. I sat with that full conversation for a long time, feeling a slow, uncomfortable understanding settle over me. My mother's version of events, the specific, damning phrases she'd attributed to my children, didn't actually appear anywhere in the conversation at all. Someone had described this conversation to her in a way that reversed who had actually been unkind to whom. I called my sister Celestine the following morning, calmly, and asked her directly to walk me through exactly what she'd told our mother and precisely where she'd got her information. "Wren showed me the messages," Celestine said, her voice carrying a defensive edge I recognized immediately as someone who hadn't expected to actually be questioned about the details. "I didn't read through everything myself. I just saw the parts Wren showed me and got upset on her behalf." "I have the full conversation saved," I said. "I'd like you to actually read through it yourself, Celestine, because I don't think what you told Mom matches what actually happened." Silence on the phone lasted long enough that I understood, even before she said anything else, that some part of my sister already suspected what she was about to discover. I sent her the screenshots, all of them in chronological order, and waited nearly 20 minutes before she called back, her voice considerably smaller than it had been during our first conversation. "Wren told me a very different version of this," she said. "She said Piper and Sawyer started it, that they were making fun of our house being too big and showing off, and that August and Wren were just defending themselves. I never actually read the messages myself. I just believed her. I want to be honest about something important here, because I think it matters to understanding how this entire situation actually developed. I don't believe Celestine set out to maliciously frame my children. I believe, based on everything that unfolded over the following weeks, that she trusted her own daughter's account without verification, in exactly the same way I initially might have trusted my own children's account without checking the actual evidence myself. But understanding Celestine's genuine confusion didn't fully explain why my mother had been so immediately, completely certain of my children's guilt, with no apparent interest in hearing my own children's side before delivering her verdict about the vacation. I found part of that answer 3 days later, during a conversation with my Aunt Rosalind, my mother's younger sister, who mentioned, almost in passing during an unrelated phone call, that Celestine had been having an unusually difficult year financially, following her husband's reduced hours at his consulting firm, and had recently asked our mother for help covering an unexpected expense related to August's private school tuition. I understood, sitting with this new piece of information, a dimension to this entire situation I hadn't initially considered. My mother's vacation fund, the 8 months of careful planning and partial financial support she'd been providing for our extended family trip, represented a meaningful, finite pool of resources. If my family were excluded from the vacation over a manufactured conflict, the portion of funding my mother had allocated for our travel expenses would presumably become available for other purposes, including, perhaps, the kind of financial support Celestine's family had apparently been quietly requesting. I want to be careful here, because I don't have definitive proof that Celestine consciously, deliberately orchestrated this entire situation as a calculated financial strategy. What I do believe, based on everything I eventually pieced together, is that a combination of genuine parental defensiveness on Wren's behalf, financial stress that made her more receptive to a narrative that might redirect family resources in her direction, and our mother's own long-standing tendency to trust Celestine's account of things without independent verification, created a situation where an ordinary, imperfect children's conflict got transformed into a story that conveniently benefited one family at the direct expense of another. I requested a family meeting with my mother, presenting the full, unedited conversation history alongside Celestine's own acknowledgement that she'd relayed an inaccurate account without verifying it herself. My mother's reaction, reading through the actual messages for the first time, moved through several stages I want to describe honestly, because I think they matter to understanding how deeply this kind of family misunderstanding can take root once it's set in motion. First, disbelief, an instinct to defend the version of events she'd already committed to. Then, slowly, as she read further, a kind of quiet, devastated recognition of exactly how unfair her immediate judgment had been. "I should have asked you directly before deciding anything," she finally said. "I heard Celestine's version, and because she sounded so certain, so upset on Wren's behalf, I didn't think to question it. I'm sorry, Wynne. I'm sorry to Piper and Sawyer most of all." The vacation, originally scheduled for the following month, proceeded with both branches of the family included, though I want to be honest that the weeks leading up to it involved several considerably more difficult conversations than a simple apology, Conversations between Piper, Sawyer, Wren, and August, facilitated carefully by both Celestine and me, working through not just the specific messages that had caused the initial conflict, but the broader pattern of comparison and competition between the cousins that had been quietly building for longer than either of us had previously recognized. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Piper the week before we left for that vacation, because I think it matters more than any of the family politics that preceded it. I was scared everyone believed I did something really mean, she told me, sitting on the edge of her bed. Even though I knew I didn't say those things, it felt like it didn't matter what I actually did, because Grandma already decided. I told her something I've thought about often since that entire situation unfolded, that sometimes people we love make mistakes not because they don't care about us, but because trusting the people closest to them feels easier than asking hard questions, and that the real measure of a family isn't whether mistakes like that happen, but whether people are willing to actually look at the truth once it's placed clearly in front of them, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The vacation itself, when it finally happened, included a small, deliberate gesture I want to describe, because I think it captures something important about how this entire situation eventually resolved. On the second evening, sitting around a shared dinner table on the porch of the beach house, my mother asked both Piper and Sawyer, and Wren and August, to each share one thing they genuinely appreciated about their cousins, not as a punishment or a forced apology, but as a quiet, deliberate effort to rebuild something that had been unfairly damaged by an initial rush to judgment. I watched my mother listen to 4 children describe, in their own imperfect, genuine 10-year-old language, exactly why they loved being cousins with each other. And I understood, watching her expressions soften with each answer, that she was working through her own quiet guilt about how quickly she'd been willing to believe the worst about my children based on an account she'd never actually verified. Celestine and I talked more honestly that week than we had in years, about the financial pressure she'd been under, about the specific insecurity that had made her more receptive to a narrative that reflected poorly on my family, rather than examining her own daughter's role in the original conflict more carefully. I don't think this story ends with any dramatic, permanent rupture in our family. I think it ends, more honestly, with all of us understanding a little more clearly how easily an ordinary children's disagreement can be reshaped into something considerably more damaging, once assumptions go unquestioned and evidence goes unexamined, and how much genuine repair becomes possible once someone finally takes the time to actually look closely enough to find the truth. Piper and Wren share a room every summer at that same beach house now, an arrangement they specifically requested themselves the following year. And I think, watching them fall asleep most nights still talking and laughing well past when they're supposed to be quiet, that this is exactly the kind of family closeness worth protecting carefully enough to get the full story right before ever deciding who deserves to be excluded from it.